The air in the municipal archives tasted of forgotten paper and the slow crawl of time. It clung to my clothes, seeped into my skin, a subtle perfume of epochs gone by. My corner, nestled between towering shelves of criminal dockets and property deeds, was my sanctuary, a quiet realm where the whispers of the past rarely disturbed the present. I, UserGV, had cultivated this existence, a meticulous life of order amidst the city's chaotic sprawl. Each day, the rustle of vellum, the scent of decaying leather, the methodical click of my scanner were the only companions I sought. Today, my task was the unglamorous sifting through Box 73B, a forgotten repository from an old evidence locker slated for long-term digital preservation. The manifest simply listed miscellaneous police effects, pre-1990. My fingers, calloused from countless hours spent turning brittle pages, moved with practiced grace, separating files, flattening dog-eared corners, coaxing the silent stories from their dusty sleep. I unearthed a tarnished badge, its eagle crest faded, then a collection of frayed photographs, mugshots mostly, faces etched with the desperation of petty crimes. A child's drawing, surprisingly vibrant, depicting a lopsided house and a smiling sun, made me pause. What journey had brought this innocent scrap into the cold embrace of evidence? I filed it away, my heart aching with the silent narratives these objects contained. Deeper still, beneath a stack of parking violation tickets and a defunct, heavy police-issue flashlight, my fingers brushed against something foreign. It wasn't the coarse cardboard of another file, nor the slick plastic of an evidence bag. It was firm, smooth, and oddly cool. My breath hitched, a small, involuntary intake of the archival air. An old instinct, honed by years of uncovering the hidden and the overlooked, stirred within me. I pulled it free. No official stamp, no departmental emblem marred its cover. It looked like something a merchant might keep or a private collector. Its very presence among the standard official detritus of Box 73B was an anomaly, a rogue thread in the meticulous weave of my ordered universe. My lamp cast a stark, yellow pool across the desk as I carefully opened it. This was no ordinary log. The entries were terse, almost poetic in their brevity, yet bristled with an undercurrent of something clandestine. Dates, names, or rather, rolls and sums of money that made my eyes widen. August 12, 1978, the collector, 1-2M Exchange Point Delta. September 3, 1978, the architect, $500K oversight fee. October 20, 1978, the enforcer, $300K silencing. The words were like stones dropped into a still pond, each creating ripples of unease. My archivist's mind, trained to connect disparate facts, began to weave a tapestry of suspicion. This wasn't police business, this was something else entirely. A private accounting, perhaps, of illicit dealings. As I turned more pages, the pattern solidified. There were notes, too, scribbled in the margins, sometimes in a different hand, sometimes in what looked like a cipher. $800K. Delivery confirmed at border crossing checkpoint at 2 a.m. No witnesses. The precision of that detail, the specific time and place, stood out like a beacon in the ledger's murky depths. It wasn't just money. It was movement, a network. My fingers trembled slightly as I traced the elegant script. I had read enough police reports, enough criminal histories, to recognize the echoes of something vast and predatory. This wasn't a ledger of petty theft. These were the meticulous records of a grand operation, a hidden economy thriving beneath the polished facade of the city. These were orchestrators, power brokers, the kind of individuals whose influence reached into the very foundations of the city. My quiet, orderly world, built on the predictable rhythms of the past, suddenly felt precarious, balanced on the edge of a precipice. I was no detective, merely a keeper of records, a custodian of what had been. The ledger, silent and unassuming, hummed with a dangerous energy. It felt heavy, not just with its physical weight, but with the burden of its truth. The quiet hum of the building's ancient ventilation system, usually a comforting backdrop, now sounded like a conspiratorial murmur. I closed the ledger, its leather cover cool beneath my fingertips, but the images of those cryptic entries were burned into my mind. My heart, usually a steady drum, began to tap out a faster, more insistent rhythm. The simple act of discovery had transformed me, pulling me from the quiet periphery into the very heart of a decades-old mystery. My breath caught, a silent plea hanging in the archival dust. The past, in the form of this silent book, had finally reached out and claimed me. The words of the ledger, precise and cold, had etched themselves into the very fabric of my thoughts. Border crossing checkpoint at 2 a.m. They pulsed behind my eyelids even as I walked home from the archive, a phantom glow in the deepening twilight. My small apartment, usually a haven of quiet order, felt suddenly too vast, its silence echoing with the unasked questions the ledger had unearthed. I pulled the heavy tome from its hiding place beneath a stack of innocuous tax records, the leather cover cool beneath my fingertips. The meticulous hand that had penned these entries seemed to mock me with its elegant loops and flourishes, each line a thread in a tapestry of deceit. I traced the specific entry again, the ink faded but resolute. Border crossing checkpoint at 2 a.m. It wasn't just a place or a time, it was a key. My mind, usually so adept at cataloging and cross-referencing historical data, spun through decades of local news archives, police reports, and even obscure trade journals I'd processed. It spoke of a meticulously planned operation, not a spontaneous act of desperation. The sheer audacity of it, moving something of immense value across a heavily monitored border, suggested protection, influence. Then, a flicker of recognition, a long-buried memory from an old, discarded newspaper clipping I'd once filed away. A notorious incident, hushed up quickly, involving an unusually quiet night at that very checkpoint, followed by a flurry of unexplained resignations and transfers within the Border Patrol. At the time, it had been attributed to bureaucratic reshuffling, a convenient narrative for public consumption. But now, seen through the lens of this ledger, the pieces began to click into place with an unnerving precision. He had somehow retired to a life of unimaginable luxury, untouched by scandal. I wasn't merely looking at a forgotten crime. I was peering into the very foundations of the city's elite, a network of power so entrenched it felt unassailable. The diamonds weren't just jewels, they were a currency of control, a symbol of an unspoken pact among the untouchable. My quiet life, dedicated to the dusty echoes of the past, had suddenly collided with a very dangerous present. I spent hours poring over the ledger, my eyes scanning for any further clues, any explicit names. My determination, usually reserved for unearthing obscure historical facts, hardened into something more formidable. I couldn't unsee what I had seen. This truth, however perilous, demanded to be brought into the light. As the first tendrils of dawn began to paint the sky a bruised purple, I finally pushed the ledger away, my mind reeling. The air in my apartment felt heavy, thick with unspoken threats. I stood, stretching stiff limbs, and walked towards the window, pulling back the curtain. The street below was still mostly deserted, save for a lone delivery van pulling away from a corner store. Then I saw it. It hadn't been there when I'd arrived home last night. My gaze lingered, a prickle of unease crawling up my spine. The vehicle was nondescript, but its stillness, its silent vigil, felt charged. I told myself it was nothing, a neighbor, a visitor, an early commuter. A tremor, faint but undeniable, ran through me. Had I been so engrossed in the ledger's secrets that I had missed something? My meticulous nature, my very strength, suddenly felt like a vulnerability. I moved through my apartment, a sudden, inexplicable urge to check the lock seizing me. The front door was secure, the deadbolt thrown. But as I turned from it, my eyes caught on something subtle, something out of place on my small, cluttered desk. A stack of old postcards, which I always kept perfectly aligned, was ever so slightly askew. Not much, just a hair's breadth, but enough to trigger a discordant note in my carefully ordered world. I was no longer merely an archivist unearthing secrets. I was being watched. My small apartment, usually a haven of quiet, now felt like a stage set for an unseen drama, every shadow a potential observer. Sleep, that gentle thief of consciousness, had been a reluctant visitor, leaving me to wander the labyrinthine corridors of my own mind, the numbers and names from the ledger echoing like a somber chant. The next morning, the taste of burnt coffee on my tongue, I pulled out the warn card given to me by the detective from the Major Crimes Unit. His face, a landscape of weary lines, had offered a fleeting reassurance when I'd made the anonymous tip. Now, that memory felt distant, almost naive. One ring, two, then a click. He's been reassigned. It finally offered, a dismissive flick of information before ending the call with an abrupt finality that left a metallic tang in my mouth. Reassigned, just like that. The thread so carefully spun snapped. This wasn't just a misdirection, it was a deliberate severance. The powerful figures I'd glimpsed in the ledger, their names whispered in the hushed annals of the city's elite, were already moving. Their reach, I now understood, extended further than I had dared to imagine, into the very veins of officialdom. I spent the afternoon sifting through digital newspaper archives, my screen a glowing portal to the past. The Diamond Heist, a sensational headline decades ago, quickly faded into the background, overshadowed by other events, then disappeared entirely. No follow-ups, no arrests, no closure. And then I found it a small, almost invisible piece, tucked away in the society pages from that same period. A photograph of the city's then mayor, his arm linked with a prominent industrialist, both smiling, confident. The industrialist, a name that had reappeared in the cryptic margins of the ledger, looked directly at the camera, a glint in his eye that seemed to mock the passage of time. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with an alarming precision. My archival work at the police evidence warehouse, usually a solace, now felt like a cage. Every rustle of paper, every creak of the old floorboards held a new, sinister resonance. A colleague, usually a garrulous sort, avoided my gaze, his movements stiff, his words clipped. He seemed to shrink into himself whenever I approached, a silent signal of warning. There was my presence already marked. The air thickened with unspoken anxieties. That evening, a sense of gnawing unease propelled me from my apartment. The city outside, usually a comforting cacophony, now felt like a labyrinth of watchful eyes. I found myself walking aimlessly, drawn by an invisible current, until I stopped before the grand, imposing facade of a historical society building. A black sedan, polished to a liquid sheen, idled across the street, its tinted windows impenetrable. My breath caught. I slowed my pace, feigning interest in a shop display, stealing glances. My heart thrummed a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I wasn't just being watched, I was being hunted. They weren't hiding anymore. They were showing me they knew they saw, and they were unafraid. Who could I trust? The authorities were compromised. My quiet life, once a sanctuary, was now a target. As midnight approached, the phantom glow of the ledger's words returned with renewed intensity. Border crossing checkpoint at 2 a.m. A desperate, reckless urge took hold. If the official channels were blocked, if my anonymous tip had only served to alert the very people it sought to expose, then perhaps there was another way. A dangerous, solitary path. I hailed a cab, my voice surprisingly steady as I gave the address. The driver, a man lost in the rhythm of his own music, seemed oblivious to the storm brewing within me. The city lights blurred into streaks of color as we sped through the quiet streets, each mile bringing me closer to the edge of the known world, closer to the precipice of a truth I now knew I could not unsee. My hands clasped tightly in my lap, gripped tight. This was it, the crossing. The time was drawing near. I knew with a certainty that both terrified and galvanized me that whatever waited at that lonely stretch of road at the border crossing checkpoint at 2 a.m. held the next terrible piece of the puzzle, and I was going to find it. The ledger's decree, stark and unyielding, continued its silent thrum beneath my skin. Border crossing checkpoint at 2 a.m. It was a whisper from the past, a command I found myself unable to ignore. My small apartment, usually a balm for frayed nerves, offered no solace now. Its quiet simply amplified the clamor of my own thoughts. The city outside stretched, a vast, indifferent canvas, yet within its sprawling indifference I knew eyes could be watching, shadows could be coalescing. The anonymous tip, my desperate attempt to shed this burden, had only tethered me more firmly to its dangerous weight. I could not simply wait, a moth drawn to the inevitable flame. The ledger had given me a thread, however perilous, and I felt an inexplicable pull to follow it. I needed another light, however dim. My mind drifted to a name I had once heard whispered in the hushed corridors of the archive, a journalist, known for a relentless pursuit of forgotten truths, a reputation earned through a series of investigations that often brushed against the city's unassailable facade. I had never sought her out, my world then a quiet universe of dusty documents and precise cataloging. Now her name felt like a sudden, urgent beacon. It took an agonizing hour of careful searching, sifting through digital remnants to unearth a contact number, a relic from an older, less guarded time. My thumb hovered, a hesitant pendulum, before pressing the call. The voice on the other end was a gravelly alto, sharp with suspicion. "Who is this?" she asked, her tone devoid of warmth. I introduced myself, my voice a thin reed against the backdrop of my racing pulse. I did not mention the ledger directly, merely the implication of its contents. A long, considering silence stretched across the line, taut and brittle. "Meet me," she finally stated, the words clipped and precise. The old clock tower square, midnight. The journey to the clock tower square was a study in heightened awareness. The air, usually crisp, felt thick with unspoken things. When I arrived, the square was largely deserted, the monumental clock above casting a long, skeletal finger across the cobblestones. He was already there, a figure hunched on a bench, her silhouette stark against the glow of a distant street lamp. Her face, when she turned, was a roadmap of experience, etched with lines of skepticism and a profound weariness. His eyes, however, held a spark of something unextinguished. "UserGV," he acknowledged, his gaze piercing. "You mention names and a date. Speak plainly if you wish to speak at all. My time for riddles vanished with my last paycheck." I laid out the bones of my discovery, careful to omit specifics that might compromise the ledger's physical location, but painting a vivid picture of its implications. I spoke of the diamond heist, the untouchable figures, and then the phrase that seemed to hang in the air between us, a spectral hum, border crossing checkpoint at 2 a.m. A flicker, a ghost of recognition crossed her face. She reached into a worn satchel at her feet and pulled out a faded, brittle newspaper clipping, its edges yellowed with age. "You're talking about the Midnight Syndicate," she murmured, her voice losing some of its earlier cynicism. "The paper wouldn't touch it, not officially. Too many powerful hands in too many pockets, but I followed a thread once. Not just any sedan, mind you, a specific model, heavily modified. It was spotted near that very checkpoint, border crossing checkpoint at 2 a.m., on a night very close to the heist. My source, a low-level customs officer, vanished right after he gave me this." She tapped the clipping. It was an innocuous local news piece, buried deep, reporting on a minor administrative change at the checkpoint, yet her finger pointed to a barely legible handwritten note scrawled in the margin. "Sedan. Black. 2 a.m. Syndicate." A shiver traced its way down my spine, not of fear but of profound recognition. This was it. The journalist, her weary eyes now alight with a rekindled fire, had given me more than information. He had given me a reason, a specific target. My uncertainty began to recede, replaced by a surge of determined energy. "Why tell me now?" I asked, the question escaping on a breath. He sighed, a sound heavy with years of disillusionment. "Because you're foolish enough to still believe in truth, UserGV, and because I'm too old to chase ghosts, but not too old to recognize a live one when it walks into my square. If you're going to stir the pot, make sure you know what you're looking for. The black sedan. Look for traces. Anything out of place, anything that shouldn't be there, anything left behind from that night, however small." Her words, sharp and precise, were a new compass needle, The Midnight Syndicate, the black sedan, the border crossing checkpoint at 2 a.m. My mind, once a chaotic tangle of fear and doubt, now felt focused, a sharpened blade. A quiet hum of purpose resonated through me. I was no longer merely reacting. I was moving, propelled by the ledger's truth and the journalist's grim corroboration. The decision was made. The border crossing checkpoint at 2 a.m. awaited, and I would be there. I thanked the journalist, a silent promise in my eyes, and turned, walking away from the square towards the desolate promise of the night. The city's vastness no longer felt indifferent. It felt like a labyrinth I was determined to navigate. Every step I took was a conscious act of defiance, each breath a testament to a growing, fierce resolve. The road ahead was fraught, I knew, but I was no longer a bystander. I was a participant, and the night was just beginning to unfold its secrets. The cold night air, once a biting torment, now felt like a sharpening stone against my skin. The informant's words, Midnight Syndicate, the black sedan, the border crossing checkpoint at 2 a.m., had carved away the fog of my fear, leaving a stark, dangerous clarity. I had a direction, a thread to pull, even if it led into a labyrinth of shadows. My first thought was of the detective. He had been a reluctant ally, a man tethered by regulations but with a flicker of something more, a yearning for justice that resonated with my own newfound resolve. I found the detective in his usual haunt, a coffee-stained desk under the harsh glow of a single lamp, a sentinel against the encroaching night. His face, etched with the weariness of too many unsolved cases, lifted as I approached. There was no need for preamble. My urgency was a palpable thing, a frantic pulse in the quiet room. The Midnight Syndicate. I began, my voice a low, urgent murmur, and a border crossing checkpoint at 2 a.m. I laid out the informant's fragmented revelations. The detective listened, his gaze unblinking, the gears of his mind visibly turning behind his tired eyes. Beneath it, I sensed a spark of shared conviction, a recognition of the desperate hope I now carried. We spoke in hushed tones, mapping out a strategy. The drive to the border was a journey through the heart of the night. The city lights receded, replaced by the vast, ink-eye canvas of the rural landscape. My hands, clasped in my lap, felt clammy, a nervous tremor running through them despite my resolve. The detective beside me was a silent, stoic presence, his focus unwavering on the road ahead, his grip tight on the steering wheel. We observe, we don't engage. This wasn't about cataloging dusty ledgers anymore. This was about survival, a desperate gamble against an unknown adversary. As we drew closer, the border crossing checkpoint at 2 a.m. materialized out of the gloom. It wasn't the brightly lit, bustling artery I had imagined, a gateway between worlds. A single guard stood by a small booth, his silhouette indistinct against the faint glow, a lonely sentinel in the vast emptiness. Then I saw it. Parked discreetly to the side, half obscured by a cluster of evergreen trees, was a black sedan. It was precisely as the informant had described, a predatory whisper in the night. The detective held up a hand, signaling for me to stop. The digital clock on the detective's wrist blinked. 1:58 a.m. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the stillness, echoing the frantic pace of my thoughts. Any moment now. Any moment the past would bleed into the present, and we would finally glimpse the faces behind the ledger's cryptic entries. 2:00 a.m. The air crackled with an unseen energy. He moved with an unsettling grace, his gaze sweeping the desolate landscape, not with curiosity but with an unnerving, predatory awareness. He wasn't just waiting, he was watching. They met by the sedan, their exchange brief, almost imperceptible. No package, no overt transfer, just a silent, knowing communion, a clandestine ritual performed under the cloak of night. My eyes darted to the detective. His jaw was clenched, his brow furrowed, a grim understanding dawning in his eyes. This wasn't the clandestine exchange we had anticipated. My breath caught in my throat. Adrenaline surged, a bitter taste in my mouth, metallic and sharp. We scrambled, thorns tearing at our skin, the harsh glare of the flashlight beam dancing behind us, a relentless eye. Footsteps pounded on the gravel, closing in, shattering the illusion of official neutrality. They knew, I gasped, stumbling over a root, the detective's grip steadying me, pulling me forward. They knew we'd come. It was a diversion. The detective growled, his voice tight with frustration, a low rumble of anger. A trap. The Midnight Syndicate wasn't just powerful, it was prescient. They had anticipated our move, turning the informant's crucial tip into a lure, a poisoned bait. The black sedan, the border-crossing checkpoint at 2 a.m. It was all a carefully orchestrated charade. They hadn't been making a transfer, they had been waiting for us. The ledger, the truth I sought to uncover, was not merely buried. It was guarded by minds as sharp and ruthless as any I had ever encountered. The mystery had deepened, yes, but so had the shadow of their reach, a chilling testament to their cunning and the vast resources at their disposal. We had walked into their net, and only by sheer luck had we slipped out for now. But the message was clear. They were watching always. The forest floor, a tangled tapestry of roots and damp earth, became my only friend, each rustle of leaves a whispered warning. We plunged deeper, the informant a shadow just ahead, our breath ragged plumes in the frigid air. They had anticipated our move, turning the informant's crucial tip into a calculated snare. My legs burned, lungs aching with each gasping intake. The adrenaline, a bitter tonic, kept me moving, but exhaustion gnawed at the edges of my resolve. We stumbled into a clearing, a forgotten logging trail overgrown with thorny brambles, and collapsed beneath the skeletal arms of a massive oak. The informant pulled a crumpled map from a hidden pocket, its edges softened by sweat and wear. "They'll be sweeping the main roads," they murmured, voice raw. "We need to go cross-country, then find a way to the north." The north. It was a physical anchor in the swirling chaos, its cryptic entries a silent promise of truth. While the informant scanned the map by the faint glow of a phone screen, I pulled the ledger forth, my eyes tracing the familiar, unsettling script. The syndicate's prescience gnawed at me. How did they know? Always a step ahead. My mind, despite the fatigue, raced, searching for an overlooked detail, a pattern in their uncanny foresight. I flipped past the diamond inventories, the coded dates, and the veiled references to powerful figures. My gaze snagged on a series of seemingly innocuous entries towards the back, jotted in a different hand, a more precise, almost administrative script. They weren't about diamonds or dates, but about deliveries. Specific, seemingly random items, specialized printing presses, particular types of paper, high-grade ink, all acquired through a shell corporation I recognized from earlier entries. What struck me was the frequency and precision of these acquisitions. Always at the end of a fiscal quarter, always through the same procurement agent, always routed through a specific, isolated warehouse on the city's industrial edge. It was an archivist's instinct, a quiet hum in my bones. Not the diamonds themselves, but the machinery of their operation. They weren't just moving stolen goods, they were manufacturing something that required a constant, precise supply chain. Forgeries, documents, identities. It was the only way to explain the printing presses, the paper, the ink. And the warehouse, repeatedly mentioned as the final destination, was not merely a storage facility, but their nerve center for fabrication. This was their event, their meticulous, predictable process, the very engine of their perceived prescience. The ledger, in its quiet accounting, revealed a singular, undeniable weakness: their reliance on this physical hub for their illicit manufacturing. If their ability to forge documents, to create false trails and identities was disrupted, their prescience would crumble. They don't just anticipate, they fabricate asterisk, and they do it all in one place. We pushed on, fueled by this new, dangerous knowledge. The forest eventually spat us out onto a desolate stretch of highway, where the driver, a contact the informant had mentioned, waited in a grumbling pickup truck. The ride was silent, tense, the landscape blurring into a monochrome smear outside the window. My mind raced, piecing together a desperate plan. The warehouse, the hub of their deception, became my target. But how to get there, how to strike at the heart of their operation, when every official channel seemed compromised? There's only one way to gain enough time. The border crossing checkpoint at 2 a.m. loomed ahead, a stark beacon of fluorescent light against the pre-dawn sky. This was the choke point, the crucible. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but my resolve hardened. I gripped the ledger tighter, its secrets burning against my palm. We had to get through, not just for escape, but for the strike. The difficult choice pressed down on me. How much could I risk? How much could I sacrifice to expose the truth now that I understood their vulnerability? I looked at the informant, their face etched with fear and weariness, and knew that the plan I was forming would demand everything from both of us, perhaps more. The final confrontation was not just coming. I was now actively driving towards it, armed with a brittle hope and a deadly secret. The truck's shuddering groan ceased. A final, ragged breath exhaled into the pre-dawn stillness. I felt the abrupt halt deep in my bones, a jolt that echoed the tremor in my soul. Through the grimy window, a landscape of stark, unforgiving light unfolded. This was it, the border crossing checkpoint at 2 a.m., a brutal tableau of fluorescent glare against the indigo bruise of the sky. Barbed wire, a metallic serpent, snaked across the horizon, glinting with a malevolent sheen. My breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a fragile cloud of dread. "Time to go, archivist," the driver rumbled, his voice devoid of warmth, a chipped stone tumbling in a dry creek bed. The door creaked open, admitting a blast of icy wind that clawed at my exposed skin. I tasted dust and metal, a bitter cocktail of fear and grim determination. My muscles, stiff from hours of silent transit, protested with dull aches as I was pulled from the truck's dark maw. Before me stood a figure I now knew too well, the orchestrator, his silhouette sharp against the checkpoint lights. His gaze, even in the poor light, seemed to pierce through me, a collector admiring a newly acquired specimen. Behind him, other figures, their faces obscured by the harsh glow, moved with an almost practiced efficiency, like stagehands preparing a final, grim scene. "A simple crossing, UserGV," the orchestrator began, his voice surprisingly soft, a silk-lined trap. "A new beginning far from prying eyes. Your meticulousness, while admirable, proved." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird, yet a strange calm settled over me. This was the moment I had anticipated, the precipice I had seen looming for weeks. The archives had taught me much, not just about old papers, but about the patterns of human deceit, the predictable arrogance of those who believed themselves untouchable. It was a small victory, but it ignited a spark of resolve within me. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "I misunderstand my position, archivist. I am a loose thread, easily snipped. The ledger in its entirety is now a carefully curated fiction. My ramblings will be just that, the desperate claims of a disoriented individual at a deserted border crossing." His words were meant to crush, to obliterate any hope of resistance, but I had already read the next chapter of his playbook. There, sewn into the seam, was my own small piece of counter-narrative, a meticulously folded, waterproofed packet containing high-resolution photographic negatives of the most damning pages of the ledger. Not the whole thing, no. That was too risky, but enough. Enough to implicate, enough to burn. A deserted crossing. I pushed, my gaze sweeping past him, towards the silent customs booth, towards the desolate road leading back to the city. Or perhaps the perfect stage for a final act. The orchestrator's brow furrowed, a hairline fracture in his composure. "What theatrics are these?" he scoffed. A tremor of unease now laced his tone. He was a man of control, and my unexpected defiance was an unscripted line. Suddenly, from the very edge of the checkpoint's illumination, a new set of lights pierced the gloom. Not the stark, indifferent white of the border authority, but the flashing, urgent blue and red of emergency vehicles. The sound, initially a distant hum, swelled into the unmistakable wail of sirens, cutting through the stillness like a jagged blade. The orchestrator spun around, his meticulously planned exit unraveling before his eyes. The other figures, his enforcers, froze, their trained efficiency dissolving into confused alarm. Impossible, he breathed, the word a choked gasp. Anticipated. A meticulous archivist, you see, keeps copies, and understands the value of a well-placed anonymous tip, especially one that details a kidnapping and a high-value target at a very specific time and location. The sirens were deafening now, the flashing lights painting the barbed wire in a strobe of frantic color. From it emerged a figure, tall and resolute, not in a uniform but with the unmistakable bearing of authority. It was the detective, the one I had tried to tip off anonymously weeks ago, the one whose dismissal had nearly cost me everything. But I hadn't given up on them entirely. My follow-up message, encoded within seemingly innocuous archival references, had finally found its mark. The orchestrator, I announced, my voice ringing out, cutting through the chaos. And his operatives, they're involved in the decades-old diamond heist. The ledger holds the truth. The detective's eyes, sharp and alert, scanned the scene, settling on me, then on the orchestrator. We received an anonymous distress call, the detective stated, their voice carrying the weight of official inquiry, mentioning a specific cargo and a name. UserGV. The orchestrator, his face a mask of furious disbelief, lunged towards me. You fool, you've ruined everything. But his movement was clumsy, fueled by rage, not calculation. One of his enforcers, momentarily stunned, reacted too slowly. Before he could reach me, the detective and their accompanying officers moved with practiced speed. Hands were on the orchestrator, restraining him, pulling his back. The other figures, seeing their leader apprehended, offered only token resistance. The border guards, alerted by the commotion, emerged from their booths, their expressions a mix of confusion and trained vigilance. I felt a profound tremor run through me, not of fear but of release. The cold air no longer bit with dread but invigorated. The ledger, its secrets a suffocating weight for so long, was finally speaking its truth. The names, I said to the detective, my voice hoarse but steady. The powerful figures, they're all there. The former chief of city planning, the district attorney's father, the property magnate who built half this city, all connected to the Oakhaven diamond heist and the subsequent cover-up. I fumbled for the packet within my jacket, producing the negatives, a tiny, fragile testament to colossal greed. These are copies of the critical pages. The orchestrator, now held firmly by two officers, looked at me, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred. The truth, like a persistent ink stain, refused to be washed away. The orchestrator, his face a ruin of disbelief and venomous hatred, had been led away, his empire of lies finally crumbling under the harsh glare of truth. My hand, still tingling from the weight of the negatives I'd passed to the detective, felt strangely light. The air in that sterile room, thick with the scent of old paper and stale desperation, had begun to clear, yet a new kind of tension had settled in its place, the quiet hum of an impending storm. The detective's gaze, a hard, unyielding thing, had met mine, a silent promise of what was yet to come. But the orchestrator, a mere cog in a much grander, more insidious machine, was only the first domino. The true architects of the decades-old silence still breathed the city's air, their names etched into its very foundations. Days bled into a restless week. The city, usually a cacophony of indifferent life, seemed to hold its breath, a strange stillness preceding a seismic shift. I moved through my quiet apartment like a phantom, the echoes of the ledger's secrets whispering in every corner. My meticulous world, once a sanctuary of order, now felt like a fragile glass house teetering on the edge of a precipice. Yet amidst the disquiet, a strange resolve had taken root within me, a tenacious vine wrapping itself around the fear. I had seen the truth, held it in my hands, and there was no turning back. Then came the call, a clipped, urgent voice on the other end, pulling me from the quiet solitude of my thoughts. The detective. And so I found myself drawn, as if by an invisible thread, to the border-crossing checkpoint at 2 a.m. The night air was a biting sheath against my skin, carrying the faint tang of exhaust fumes and distant pine. Floodlights, stark and unforgiving, carved out a harsh landscape from the pre-dawn gloom, illuminating the serpentine lines of concrete barriers and the stoic, armed figures of Border Patrol officers. The hum of idling engines, the crisp, staccato commands, the sharp glint of metal, it all converged into a single, momentous tableau, heavy with unspoken anticipation. My heart, a relentless drum against my ribs, beat a frantic rhythm. A luxury sedan, its windows tinted to an impenetrable black, sat isolated under the most intense glare, surrounded by a phalanx of officers. I recognized the detective among them, their silhouette sharp against the artificial light, their gaze sweeping the scene with an almost predatory focus. A subtle nod, almost imperceptible, passed between us, a shared understanding of the precipice we now stood upon. The orchestrator's confession, painstakingly extracted, had been the key that unlocked the final, gilded cage. The negatives I had discovered images not just of coded messages and clandestine meetings, of the very blueprints of the vault, annotated in a distinctive hand. They didn't merely implicate, they condemned. The orchestrator had been a loyal, ruthless enforcer, but the true masterminds, the ones who had pulled the strings from the highest echelons of the city, were the venerable Judge Caldwell and the patriarch of the Sterling family, a man whose philanthropic endeavors were celebrated on every society page. The quiet life I had once cherished, a life of dust and forgotten histories, felt irrevocably distant, shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. Yet in its place, a different strength had bloomed, resilient and sharp, like a rare desert flower. The sedan's door opened with a soft click, a sound swallowed by the vastness of the night. A figure emerged, blinking against the harsh floodlights, his once impeccable suit now rumpled, his face a mask of desperate, aged fear. It was Judge Caldwell, his usual composed demeanor utterly evaporated, replaced by the raw panic of a cornered animal. His carefully constructed facade, decades in the making, had finally fractured, revealing the rot beneath. He was trying to flee, to slip across the border and disappear, but the net had finally closed. The weight that had pressed upon me for weeks, a suffocating shroud of danger and uncertainty, began to lift. It wasn't a sudden lightness, but a gradual release, like the slow exhale after holding one's breath for too long. The archivist in me, once content to merely preserve the past, had become an active participant in shaping the present, a quiet force against the tide of forgotten injustice. The world would never look the same. My quiet existence was gone, replaced by a sharpened awareness, a vigilance that would forever reside within me. But for me, the true treasure wasn't the sparkling gems. It was the courage I had unearthed within myself, a resilience forged in the crucible of fear. The journey had ended, but the story of UserGV, the archivist who dared to look closer, had just truly begun.